So economies of scale is an area that typically students find quite difficult. But if you spend a bit of time learning the economies of scale, there's nothing inherently difficult about them. And it's also a useful concept to understand for the rest of the course as well. So once you grasp it, you'll be able to put it into all of the 4 exams. So the specification says that you need to be able to understand what internal and external economies and diseconomies of scale are. You need to, they did really emphasise this diagram drawing part of the course. They've never asked for a question on that before, but they did emphasise it on a course that I went on once. So make sure you can draw the diagram and explain how they can benefit from economies of scale and how they can suffer from diseconomies of scale. So basically, the concept of economies of scale are that bigger is better. So we can see on this website here, if you buy one of these file boxes, you can have it for $14.99. But if you buy 5 more or more of them, you can have them each for $12.99. So the more you buy, the less per unit it's going to cost you. And that's the concept of economies of scale. That's a certain type of economy of scale, purchasing economy of scale, but it's the general concept that the more you produce, the more you make, the cheaper production becomes. So when we're looking at economies of scale, we need to know what unit costs or average costs are. So it basically just represents the total costs of production divided by the total unit. So you're getting the cost per, on average of producing one item. And over the long run, what we start to see is that the more you produce, you get this downward sloping average cost, long run average total cost curve. So this is what we call economies of scale, so where average costs are falling as output increases. But at a certain point, it gets to its lowest point, and then it starts to increase again. And this side of the diagram is what we call the diseconomies of scale, where the long run average cost start to increase again as output increases. So let's have a look at why that happens, and let's get clear on some definitions. So economies of scale are just where the unit cost or the average cost of production decreases following an increase in output. And then diseconomies of scale is where that unit costs increase as output increases. So we start to see output increasing. We've got economies of scale because the average cost is decreasing, but after a certain point it starts to increase, so we've got diseconomies of scale. Internal economies of scale or diseconomies of scale are the economies of scale or the benefits, or if it's diseconomies of scale, it'd be the costs of growth that arise within the firm. So we're just looking at one firm getting bigger. What are the benefits for that particular firm of internal economies of scale? When we're looking at external economies of scale, we're looking at the benefits of the whole industry, the group of firms growing together. So here's an overview. There's loads of different types of economies of scale. This is not an exhaustive list, but if you think about the ones that are most memorable to you, I bet it's probably like purchasing. Purchasing is quite a straightforward one, and financial and risk bearing, quite straightforward ones. And just learn those. Usually in the exam, they're going to ask you for example of 2 maximum, but learn 3 to be on the safe side. So the blue ones are the internal economies of scale, so they happen as the firm itself gets bigger, and then the red ones are external economies of scale, so the benefits of being bigger as the industry grows. So this is just a quick whip through all of them. You can find out more information on the textbook, but first of all, purchasing economies of scale, really straightforward to understand. When me and my husband first moved in together, I used to send him to the supermarket to get toilet paper, and he used to annoy me so much because he'd go and get me like a small packet, with just kind of like 4 rolls in, and I'd be like, why would you do this? It's much cheaper to get a really big one with more, like 16 rolls in, because their price per roll becomes cheaper. And this is the same for businesses buying the materials that they need. The more they buy, the cheaper per unit they get it for. Usually businesses are willing to give them a discount, so that means that their average costs will fall. Marketing economies of scale are slightly different. It just means as the company gets bigger, the average cost of marketing and promoting a new product falls and usually gets a little bit cheaper, but purchasing is the easy one to remember. Technical economies of scale. This is not one I'd recommend you write about in the exam, but it is a type of economy of scale, and you have to have quite specific examples for this. But here we have a double-decker bus. Now, the most expensive part of a bus is going to be the engine and the chassis. And imagine if you just had a single-decker bus, that'd be kind of the average cost of transporting one person would be shared among the number of people you can get on that bottom deck. But if you have a double decker, you don't need two chassis, you don't need two engines, but you also get more seats, so you can fit many more people in. So the average cost decreases. So you get this with shipping containers as well. Like the bigger the size, the smaller the kind of average cost of transporting one unit would be. But it's hard to understand and relate to some examples. An easier one is specialist or managerial. Now, as the business gets bigger, they can afford to employ specialists in certain roles. So one of those roles might be an accountant, and they should be more efficient at their job, so they should be able to increase the output. So more output, whereas you just pay the accountant the same, regardless of whether they're producing more output or not so much output. So if they're better at the job because they're more specialised in it and they produce more, you're dividing the cost of the accountant amongst more units of output. So that's why the costs decrease. Risk bearing is a really simple one to understand. Here we have lots of the logos for Virgin brands, and you can see they're in so many different markets. Virgin Money, Virgin Atlantic, Virgin America, I didn't even know that was a thing. So many things on here. Virgin Active, all the gyms. And one of the reasons that they do this is because they diversified into different markets. So it's basically the strategy where you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So you're reducing risk by being in lots of different markets at the same time, lots of different products. So if there is a downfall in one of them, that you're not too harmed as a company. Whereas if you're quite a small business, you're not able to expand into all of these different areas in these markets. Financial economies of scale. This is a really nice one to look at. So the bigger you are, as we learnt in Sources of Finance, the easier it is to get a loan from banks. And usually the less risky you are as a business, so they're willing to give you a lower rate of interest. So reduces your costs, quite simple. This would be an external economy of scale. So if we think about 100 years ago, there weren't many flights operating, there weren't many planes, so there wouldn't have been very many trained pilots. So if you wanted to recruit a pilot for your newly set up airline, you'd probably have to train the pilot. Whereas now there are so many airlines and therefore so many pilots already flying. So if you were to set up a new airline, or if you are an airline and you need more people, you don't necessarily need to train them or spend a lot of money on training them, because you can get ready trained labour. So that's a benefit of the industry being established and being big. You may also find that because the industry has grown, you might get some cooperation, so different businesses working together to develop new products, even competitors working together sometimes. Or there might be an industry journal that gives you lots of information and helps make your business a bit more efficient or productive. So lots of tips here about the door industry. Very exciting. Okay, so all the good stuff then with the economies of scale, but you do eventually get to the point of diseconomies of scale. So things, bigger not being better, bigger being worse for you as a business. You've got too big. Okay, so we've got internal that happen as the individual business get bigger, and also the external diseconomy of scale of the industry getting bigger. So communication becomes a lot harder if you're a larger business, maybe spread over many different countries. You may even have to spend more on communication technology, and there may be more miscommunication incidents, and that may cause waste and cost money and loss of productivity, as you can see from this cartoon. Bigger businesses are harder to coordinate and harder to schedule. I used to work for a really, really large business accounting firm that had 10,000 employees in the UK, and we had to employ specialist people called schedulers, and they used to schedule you on projects. And I think in my department, which was only a small section of the business, I think there were 4 schedulers working. So you have to employ extra people to kind of coordinate these things, and you have to have project managers, and it gets more costly. Also, motivation may suffer. So I love the beginning of this film, Ants, and the little ant is in the kind of psychiatrist's chair, and he's saying, "I just feel really insignificant." And the psychiatrist says, "Yes, we're making a breakthrough. You are insignificant." And that's how you might feel if you work for a really large company. You might feel that you're just a really small part of the organisation. You're just a small cog, and your output doesn't really matter. And you might not try as hard as you would have done, or work as hard as you would have done had you been working for a smaller organisation. Technical also features as a diseconomy of scale. So this is apparently the largest container shipper in the world, and it's very big, as you can see. But if there was a problem with this, or there was I don't know, it went off track, it'd be quite hard to get it back on track, because it's unwieldy, it's less flexible than a smaller ship. So the bigger maybe your factory is, the harder it is to be maybe flexible, or to heat it, or to solve problems when things go wrong. But again, technical is quite difficult to explain, so I'd stay away from those ones. And then lastly, overcrowding. This is a picture of Mumbai, actually, obviously like a business district in Mumbai. And one of the problems is if the industry becomes too big, so too many competitors, they force the price of the supplies, all the materials that you need for your product, up, because there's so much demand for them, because there's so many businesses. And so that increases your costs of production. So that would make your average costs increase. So internal economies of scale, so where the average costs decrease as output increases, and that happens as the output of a firm increases. External economies of scale, where average cost decrease as the size of the industry increases. Internal diseconomies of scale, where average costs increase as output increases. And external diseconomies of scale, where average costs increase as the industry increases in size. Your diagram is that big U shape with economies of scale, then diseconomies of scale, and you need to be able to explain all the economies of scale. So I would learn financial, because it's easy. Purchasing, again, bulk buying, easy to explain. Risk bearing, maybe, or managerial, and diseconomies of scale, coordination, motivation, quite straightforward. Make sure you learn one external economy of scale and one external diseconomy of scale as well. So we've got overcrowding for the diseconomy of scale, and what could we have for the external economy of scale? Labour. It's quite straightforward to explain.